Hello and welcome to Inside 11Alive News Investigates. I'm Cheryl Preheim. In April, President Donald Trump announced a plan to impose sweeping tariffs that rattled the stock market and put businesses on notice. 2 months later, 11Alive investigative reporter Zach Merchant traveled to Georgia's coast to see how tariffs have impacted a critical hub for international trade. Take a look.
One of Georgia's key gateways to the international economy flows right through these waters off the coast of Savannah. The ships that move on to the ports in Savannah and Brunswick here carry goods Georgians use every day, and a lot of them, says Georgia Southern University economist Michael Toma.
We are the number 3 container port in the United States, so we are playing in the big leagues.
It is a financial engine generating billions in economic impact for the state. But all that international trade makes Georgia's ports highly sensitive to international tariffs that function as a tax importers have to pay on goods they bring into the country.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day.
President Donald Trump's April announcement of a raft of increased tariffs rippled across the coastal industries around the ports.
It is a source of worry. It is a source of unease.
Thomas Morrison works at a trucking company that specializes in international cargo.
Between 90 to 95%, and that might be on the low end.
He worries elevated tariffs could trigger a decrease in international shipments and a decline in his business that depends on that cargo. And he says the White House's repeated changes to the tariff regime make planning for the future a challenge.
It's hard to keep up.
But others view the tariffs as a lifeline.
How has it evolved over your years involved in this industry?
Slowly dying.
John Wallace is a shrimper and advocates for the industry in Georgia. He says overseas competitors have been undercutting domestic shrimpers for years, driving them out of business.
I worry about the future. I can count on one hand the people less than 40 years old that are in the industry.
Wallace views tariffs as a tool that could level the playing field.
You'd like to see tariffs increased.
Oh, Lord, yes.
The shrimpers and the truckers are a snapshot of just a few of the industries impacted, all in their own ways, by these sweeping tariffs. The ports are feeling the impact. In April, President Trump implemented a 90-day pause on some of his steepest tariffs. That same month, the Georgia Ports Authority reported a 17% year-over-year increase in trade through the Port of Savannah.
Effectively, your importers, people who were dependent on an overseas supply chain, were rushing to get as much of their product into the U.S. before the tariffs were levied on it.
But the situation continues to evolve as the White House negotiates trade deals with other countries around the world. What that will mean for trade through Georgia's ports and the prices Georgians see when they go to the store is still an open question.
The effect on the average Georgia consumer remains somewhat unclear.
Zach is here to talk more about this. I'm just picturing this massive game of dominoes that is not a game because it is people's livelihoods, and it impacts the biggest businesses to what you and I pay when we walk into a Walmart, right?
Ripple effect, right? Like, you hate to riff on the cliche of the water, the ocean, but that is how this functions. And you heard the economist there, Georgia Southern's Michael Toma. He mentioned towards the top of that piece, Georgia's ports, he says, are the 3rd largest in the nation. You don't often think about that sometimes. I think a lot of folks don't realize. You think of maybe Los Angeles,
Sure.
the East Coast, New York, New Jersey. Georgia's ports have an enormous impact, not just on our state, but on the entire country. Just a couple figures. Georgia Ports Authority estimates that the Georgia ports themselves are responsible for driving more than 600,000 full and part-time jobs.
Wow.
So this economic impact really just goes out through the entire economy. And there's so many tag-along industries too, right? You have the ports, you see the ships coming in.
Yeah.
But then, and Cheryl, I know you know all about this, and you focus on economic stuff too. All of these industries that work along with the ships, the customs inspectors, the longshoremen, the truck drivers. And you heard from Thomas Morrison in that piece. One of the themes that we kept hearing about, though, was this this idea of uncertainty.
Sure.
And you've been reporting on this and covering it from the desk, too.
Yeah, ever since everyone sort of was introduced to the word tariff, which, by the way, at one point was the most Googled search, what is a tariff? Because people are learning more about what it is and the impact it has. But there's been so much uncertainty because things are changing every day.
You're right, and it is worth emphasizing, too. We're talking about kind of an esoteric topic. I don't think about tariffs usually in my day-to-day. Lately I have been,
Sure.
but they function as a tax on imported goods that are paid by the importer. So if you're a domestic company importing foreign-made goods, you're the one that's paying those import duties, those tariffs, and you talk about the change. Let me just run you through just a quick snapshot, because we cover it so much. We cover it when we're reporting the news, but it's been a busy 2 months, right?
Sure.
So April 2nd, Liberation Day is what President Donald Trump called it. These tariffs are announced. Less than a week later, on April 9th, he scales that back. He implements a 90-day pause on most of the tariffs, except for tariffs on China that go up. Then about a month later, on May 12th, the tariffs on Chinese imports are reduced for about 90 days. And then last week, we had these dueling federal court rulings. One court said that these tariffs are illegal. The president has exceeded his legal authority to implement them and ordered that they be stopped. Another federal court, less than 24 hours later, said, in fact, the tariffs are good to go and allowed them to move forward for now. That's a lot of moving back and forth, right?
And then businesses are trying to respond. The stock market is going up and down because of this, and everyone else is wondering, what's this going to impact? How much I'm paying for groceries, how much I'm paying for the things my kids need, how much is a home or a car going to cost? Because all of these issues come right back down to someone's everyday budget. We've seen companies like Walmart say publicly, we are having to make adjustments on the prices that you're already seeing in stores. Then the president comes back and says you shouldn't make the customers eat it. Businesses are saying, but we have to make a profit. So it is this constant balancing act.
And businesses really like to have consistency so that they can plan for the future too, right? So you can plan how much things are going to cost, so you can plan how much you're going to charge your customers, so you can plan how much room you have in the budget to make sure you're making payroll. I mean, it's a really complicated process. I think it's a good time to go to a little bit of an extended portion of our interview with Thomas Morrison, who was a manager at that trucking company. You heard from him a little bit in the piece. Let's listen in for a little more.
It's hard to keep up. And again, I want to be clear. I want what is good and equitable for Americans. I want especially us as Georgians and in my industry to be able to have competitive wages, but it makes it very difficult to keep up with what's going on and plan for that future.
What would be your message to the White House right now?
I would say to re-examine our stance on these tariffs and to not paint with too broad a brush.
Interesting to hear the business perspective there, because I think a lot of people home say the same thing. How are we supposed to plan for what our weekly, monthly, long-term budgets are when we don't know what's happening? It's all in flux.
And Thomas, right at the end there, he said, if he got a chance to speak to the White House, and maybe he does, who knows who may see his story here. He said, don't paint with too broad a brush. And you and I have talked about this off camera too. When you talk about a topic as big and as wide reaching as tariffs, there can be an instinct people want to say, I mean, my friends will ask me, they say, hey, is this good or bad? How is this going to impact me?
Break it down for me.
Yeah, thumbs up, thumbs down, right? And certainly that's not our job to pass judgment one way or the other, but from a neutral kind of, just a journalistic perspective, these tariffs touch so many people.
It's complex.
So many industries and so many businesses that, you saw somebody like a trucker, and in the trucking industry, the logistics industry, like Thomas Morrison, that business, he said, almost exclusively relies on international trade moving through the Port of Savannah at their kind of Georgia locations and other ports across, they have multiple sites across the country, but they rely on international trade. If these tariffs lead to a reduction in that trade, he worries that's going to be bad for their business. They'll have fewer loads to, carry, right?
Yeah.
But some other businesses are welcoming this.
Like the shrimper.
Right.
Who said, oh, we need this, we need the help, that's a small business. As you're talking about the truckers, I'm thinking, you see them on 285, or 400, 85. You know, when you see those big rigs, they are moving the items that we're talking about here. So if you ever need a picture of how massive this industry is, just think about when you're in traffic on 400 and you see truck after truck after truck. Many of them are coming from the Port of Savannah.
Just take a drive down to Macon and head eastward, and you're going to get on 16, and it's a straight shot basically to the ports, and you're going to see all those trucks going back and forth. You know, one of the other impacts of these tariffs is that Michael Toma, the economist, said it can have a sort of freezing effect or a limiting effect on businesses' willingness to spend and invest, particularly if they have capital projects, new initiatives that they're thinking about spending big on. When there is uncertainty, they may try to kind of hunker down and wait for more solid footing. Let's listen in, if we can, to a little bit more of what Michael Toma said on that point.
Businesses react adversely to uncertainty, right? If a business is trying to make decisions and planning for future, they're looking at consistent growth, right? It doesn't have to be meteoric, it doesn't have to be exponential, but consistent growth that is predictable facilitates business decision making. We also face this sort of thing in our own lives too. If you're concerned about losing your job in a recession, think about it. Is that a good time to go buy a new car, right? Or to make a major purchase that might commit you to a series of payments for the next 5 years? If you're not sure that you're going to be employed in 6 months, it's probably not a wise idea to make that decision. So just like a business, a consumer, and just like a human, right? In a period of uncertainty where you would just kind of hunker down and kind of wait things out and see what happens, right? I want to know, I need more information before I can make that decision, right? Is this a temporary blip down? Is this a temporary blip up? Or is this now a new smooth glide path that I can make some predictions based on? So uncertainty causes businesses and people to just kind of hunker down and put off making big decisions that are economically related to their livelihoods and their well-being.
No doubt. When he said as a human, you just have this reaction to when things are unsettled. I think everyone can absolutely relate to that. And then ask the question, why are we so deep into this conversation about tariffs? Many presidents on both sides have not taken such a focus on this issue. And it comes down to the White House saying, well, we want to bring more manufacturing to the United States. That might, in theory, to some people sound great, but that is also a complex conversation.
It is, and we talked to Michael Toma, the economist, there about that. We've heard from plenty of other economic experts as well. The White House's position, President Trump's position, and again, you've got to remember these tariffs, they function as a tax on goods brought into the country that domestic companies have to pay. So if you work at XYZ company, you want to bring in stuff that's made overseas, and every time it crosses the border, you're paying that tariff, basically a tax to bring it in. The White House's position, President Trump's position, is that if you make it more expensive to bring in foreign goods, it will incentivize these businesses to instead shift some, and I think they would say they hope a lot of the production back into the United States, which in turn would, they say, spur more economic growth and more domestic manufacturing jobs that over the course of the last handful of decades have increasingly moved away from the United States and into these overseas locations. So that's the idea. You put up these barriers and you incentivize these companies. Kind of, you get the stick or the carrot. This is sort of the stick, saying bring these jobs back. Economists, though, and we should point out Michael Toma too, many are doubtful that this will actually take place, particularly in the short term.
Right.
Because it takes time to do that, right?
You have to build the factory. Who's going to work in the factory? Do you have the infrastructure around that? We already are in a point in the United States where a lot of skilled trade workers are at a huge shortage, to the point where some will tell me it's a crisis shortage. So all of those things are factored in. But to the individual person, most of the time the question comes back to the cost. So is a car going to cost a person more if it's made in the United States versus other places? And we're already seeing research that shows in the auto industry, when you do the ranking, American-made cars are among the most expensive. So how do you bring manufacturing back to the United States but not give customers less wiggle room when it comes to pricing.
And that theme of uncertainty too just plays such a big role here. You think of the enormous Hyundai plant right down by Georgia's coast.
Exactly.
Huge investment by a major foreign automaker, but those jobs are right here in the United States. If you go down I-16, you will see it. It's
massive.
Huge. I mean, it's almost like a small city in its scale and scope. Michael Toma, he pointed out, and that obviously they're right there. They're in the coast. They saw this project. He said that really spun up pretty quickly. It was just a couple years to build that project, which is fast in the world of business development, but it's still a couple years. And so if you're a business leader thinking about making that kind of investment spurred by tariffs, but you're seeing all of these changes in what the tariff rates are, they're on, then many of them are paused. There's a 90-day pause, except for tariffs on goods from some countries. You may have an incentive to say, I need more long-term visibility before I make that impact. But John Wallace, that shrimper we heard from, his story is a very different one.
He wants higher tariffs.
Yeah, he's been doing this his whole life. He's a shrimper, and he works with a coalition of folks on the coast who try to advocate for that industry. He told me he built his own shrimp boat by hand with his dad. I mean, they went out and they cut the trees down, they built it. He named it after his wife, called Gale Force. Her name is Gale. But he said he's been in this industry a long time, many decades, and you heard him in that story. He said he worries that his son, who's in the industry as well, he's in his 30s, will see the end of the viability of shrimping on Georgia's coast as anything more than a hobby sport, just because these overseas imports of shrimp that are caught with labor that's way cheaper than American labor can undercut the prices.
Which takes me back to something you said at the beginning. It's very difficult to say good or bad, yes or no, and to what gentleman said that he would say to President Trump, don't paint it with a broad brush. Is there a conversation out there saying, instead of saying, you know, we hear the phrase sweeping tariffs, to think more about what industry or what material specifically would make more sense to pursue this kind of aggressive tariff tax versus others instead of something broad brush? I
think certainly in the economist world, there are conversations like this, and historically we've seen industry-specific tariffs pop up in all sorts of corners of the U.S. economy, and by proxy the world economy. Right now, on the political side, the messaging really seems to be, for the most part, from the White House and from President Trump, a commitment to pursuing these kind of broad-based tariffs for now. But we've got to mention too, you know, things have just been changing so quickly. And we should mention as well, just like we talked about with Thomas Morrison, the trucker, the trucking company, how there's this whole ecosystem of businesses that rely on the business of the ports, right? It's not just the ships coming in and out. There are all these, the trucking, the infrastructure. So too, is there a tag-along knock-on industry supporting industries like shrimping?
Sure.
And you might not think of it all the time, but John Wallace does a really good job of pointing out how when one industry struggles, it can really impact and hurt other businesses that are in that ecosystem.
The threat is there because, like I said, you can have a price that can keep the boat going, but it doesn't entice anyone else to get into the industry. So the threat really is, we've already lost a lot of infrastructure. We've lost 3 docks in this county over the last 20 years. The mechanics, the railways, all those other, the infrastructure around the industry is slowly going away. People that work on the winches and stuff on the boat are, you know, they're almost non-existent. If you can't do it yourself, then it's hard to find anyone else that can do it.
A lot to unpack. There's a lot obviously going on. Uncertainty seems to be sort of the buzzword of as we report out these kinds of stories, but it's worth taking a moment right at the end here to emphasize, when you talk about tariffs, when you talk about the economy, it can easy, you know, to get lost in the policy of it. At the heart of all these stories are real people, just like Thomas Morrison, just like John Wallace. These tariffs, they're big, they're burly, they touch a lot of different industries, but at the core of it all are real people trying to make a living, take care of their families, looking for some certainty. And right now, they're being impacted in lots of different ways by this tariff regime that continues to change. We're going to keep watching it because it's a moving thing right now.
That's why it's so important that you took the time to go and talk to the people impacted. Without those perspectives, you can't fully, one, understand or to appreciate the complexity or the humanity of these conversations and the impact they're really having on our state and across the country.
And we are, I mean, it's got to be said, we are so grateful to them for taking the time to talk to us too. Some out-of-town news crew that drives down to the coast and they volunteered their time, their insight, and their candor, which is, it's everything.
Yeah, we appreciate that and appreciate you. Thank you so much, Zach. I want to remind you that if you have a story for Zach or any of our other investigators on the 11Alive team, you can reach out by calling 404-873-9111 or email investigates@11alive.com. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside 11Alive News Investigates, and we'll see you next time. Take care.